All right, guys, we're going to talk in this video about species interactions. Remember that, essentially every species is trying to increase its numbers, and so this is going to mean that the species are going to have to interact in certain ways as they all try to increase their numbers. So the first one of these interactions is something called competition, and this one is sort of one that is like a no-brainer, self-explanatory. Competition means that they're trying to compete for the same resources. There's only so many resources in a given ecosystem, and so much access to those resources, and so the species are going to compete for those. It might be plants that are competing for the same water or sunlight supplies, and so the plants that can grow the highest are more likely to get more sunlight. It might be animals that are competing for the same food sources, be it grasses or seeds or other animals or whatever, but they're going to compete to get those resources. Now, what can happen, evolutionarily speaking, is that we can have what we call resource partitioning. And basically, this means that the species are going to evolve certain traits that are going to allow them to share the resource. A great example of this resource partitioning is the honey creepers. So if you look at these two honey creepers here, this one has a really short bill and this one has a really long bill. It's not too easy, not too hard to figure out that even though these are both honey creepers, that one species being able to get much further into a flower means that it can get the nectar from the back, the other species could get the nectar from the front, and so therefore they're not going to have to struggle. They might not necessarily have to compete in quite the same way. They're still trying to access the same overall food stuff, but they're getting it in a different way. Another classic example of this is a lot of birds will occupy different levels of the tree, so top level, mid level, and bottom level, and they're going to consume the resources in that area, and they're going to have traits that are going to allow them to be able to get the resources from those areas, and they're not really going to be in competition from the things that are above and below them. Now, of course, that would mean that we're talking about specialist niches as opposed to generalists, because generalists obviously are going to be able to acquire resources from a large number of areas, so they're not usually going to partition their resources in quite that way. The other interaction is the other one that sort of pops up all the time when we think about ways that species interact, and that is predation. We tend to think of predation as, an animal predator chasing down an animal prey, like a cheetah chasing down an antelope and eating it. But it doesn't have to be something that's carnivorous in that way. I mean, if we're eating other organisms, we're eating, beans, that is predation. I mean, we are one species, a predator, eating another species. That bean species is another organism. And so that is still a predatory relationship. What's pretty interesting about a lot of these predator-prey interactions is that evolutionarily, they can adapt together over the course of time that this happens. And a great example of that are bats and moths. So bats find their prey, moths and other insects, but they're going to find moths by emitting sound, and then when that sound comes back, that sonar type thing, they're going to say, okay, my prey's over here, and they swoop over there and they grab the moth. Well, what moths learned to do, or adapted to do over time, is that they could sense those frequencies that the bats were emitting, and what the moths would do is that as soon as they heard that frequency, they would immediately fall to the ground, so that the bats then couldn't swoop them up, and they weren't in the area. Now, what bats did to sort of counter that is that bats adapted to alter the frequency at which they're emitting their sound, and so that one frequency might cause the moths to go away, but if the bats emit the other frequency, the moths aren't adapted to that yet. And you can see what this sort of leads to is almost like an evolutionary arms race between a predator and prey, and this is sort of the way it works, is that the predators try to adapt in ways that will allow them to get more prey, and the prey tries to adapt in ways that will allow it to avoid becoming prey. And so a couple of really good adaptations for each side here. Predators are usually going to want to be able to ambush their prey in some way, so they might have some sort of camouflage mechanism. Like a snowy owl is going to be really hard for the prey to pick out. They can't see where their predator is because it's against a white backdrop, and therefore it can't be seen very well. Same thing with, like, say, a polar bear. A lot of predators, of course, are going to rely on speed to catch their prey. Cheetahs, obviously a great example of that, but a lot of predators are going to have that same thing, that they're going to want to be able to go in quick bursts of speed. Then, of course, they might be adapted to have poisons or toxins that are going to help to paralyze their prey or help to even digest their prey in some cases. Prey, of course, are going to have their own adaptations. They're going to do things that will enable them to be able to get away from the predator so that they can reproduce. So they might have avoidance mechanisms, like they might be camouflaged, like insects might have a certain color, or they might look like a stick, or a rodent might be colored in brown to blend in with the dirt so that a bird flying above it can't see it. Of course, they're going to have, in many cases, speed. So something like a deer or rabbit is going to rely on its speed to be able to get out of the way, as in addition to its camouflage. They might fly or swim away. Those are avoidance mechanisms. They might have other sort of hard defense mechanisms like shells or thick bark or spines or something like that. They're going to help to ward off their predators. They might have chemical mechanisms. They might, in some cases, they might spray out a chemical just to scare things off. They might, in and of themselves, be poisonous. And what's kind of interesting is a lot of times in nature, that poisonous nature actually goes along with color. So a lot of poisonous things tend to have these really bright colors, sort of to warn their prey off, or their predators off, to say, hey, get away from me. You don't want to eat me. I'm poisonous. I will kill you. And like a poison dart tree frog, of course, is a great example of that. And then a lot of them, of course, are going to travel in groups. And so an animal that might not be able to fight back individually, when it's in a group, it's able to fight back then. So like, one antelope on its own is probably in some trouble, but maybe in a group they might be able to fight off one or two predators. The third interaction is parasitism. And this is where an organism is going to feed on another organism, but it doesn't necessarily result in the death of that organism. And so the organism is the food is the host, and then the parasite is the one that's feeding off of it. Mosquitoes are a good example, sort of an external parasite, but you've got lots of parasites in your body. You could have something like a tapeworm or something like that that is sort of eating food away from you and draining you and not doing you any benefit. So the difference between a parasite and a mutualistic relationship is in a mutualistic relationship, both things are benefiting from it. So a great example of that is bees and plants or flowers. That flowers need to be pollinated so that they can reproduce, and bees need the nutrients that they get from the flowers. And so the fact that bees pollinate flowers is a beneficial relationship to both parties, not just a single one. And so that's what mutualism is going to turn out to be. Obviously, it would be great if all of our relationships worked out that way, but they don't quite. Now, there are other sorts of things that you could argue, even though they might be predator-prey, are still mutualistic. Like, say, we might eat a plant, and then as in our waste, its seeds go out, and that's how it's going to reproduce. That has obviously some benefit. Has benefit for the species overall, but not really for that individual that got consumed, of course. And then our fifth interaction is something called commensalism. Commensalism sounds a lot like mutualism, but in this case, they're not both benefiting. One of them is, and the other one's not benefiting, but it's not really being harmed. And so you sort of see the difference between parasitism, where one's benefiting, one's being harmed. Mutualism, they're both benefiting. And then commensalism, one's benefiting, one not really being hurt that much one way or another. A great example of that are bromeliads and orchids. They're going to grow usually high up on trees. They're going to sort of plant their root system in the tree there. But they're not really leaching off so many nutrients that the tree is dying. And the main reason they're doing this is so that they can get up high so that they can have access to sunlight. So it benefits the bromeliad or the orchid there. But it doesn't really hurt the tree any. I mean, the tree's already got its canopy up there and is getting its sunlight. So it's not really being hurt that much by the plant that is having a commensalistic relationship attached to it. So that makes it different than a parasite. If it was a parasite, it would actually be